Today's headlines. Fascist environmentalists, WWF and the Club of Rome call for depopulation of the planet. And momentum builds for Steagall as reality hits. Hello, it's Thursday the 17th of May. I am Malcolm Massey and this is the UK column news. Fascist Greenie campaign group, the WWF, released its latest Living Planet report earlier this week. In an act of cynical irony, the anti-human, anti-development, anti-technology report was released internationally from the International Space Station by so-called WWF ambassador, astronaut Andrei Kuipers. In a shameful, introverted introduction, Kuipers blustered about how small our little planet looks from space, rather than looking outwards to what should be our goals, the Moon and Mars. Using the fraud of the ecological footprint, the report claims that humanity's pressure on nature to supply its needs would require 1.5 planets if the world's biocapacity is to recover each year. They argue that our requirement will rise to 2 planets by 2030 and almost 3 by 2050. The report reflects the same view of the world as the BBC, which laughs at the idea of mining asteroids off-planet, for example. Rather than proposing that our expansion into space would be a priority, the WWF argues that economic growth should be abandoned, that inhabitants of so-called wealthy nations should prepare for poverty, and that all the human race's energy should be produced using renewable energy such as the 9th century technology marvel, the windmill. Amazingly enough, all this renewable energy generating equipment needs to be built without the use of concrete or steel, which, they say, needs to be severely rationed. Of course, no WWF report would be complete unless it once again rolls out the old chestnut of depopulation growth, with its attendant suggestion of population reduction, or genocide as it's more appropriately known. Human population dynamics are a major driving force behind environmental degradation. One aspect of this is the overall size of the global population, which has more than doubled since 1950 to 7 billion in 2011 and is forecast to reach just over 9.3 billion people by 2050, the report says. The WWF report goes goose steps along with the recently released Club of Rome report entitled 2052, a global forecast for the next 40 years, which is a rehash of its anti-human, anti-development and anti-technology report from the 1970s called Limits to Growth. The 400-page of 2052 report that the process of adapting humanity to the planet's limitations has started. Both the WWF and Club of Rome feed policy international governments, directly and via the United Nations. Their policy will see this planet depopulated, and there are hints that this is exactly the policy which is in minds of our own government. Britain's infrastructure is crumbling as a result of profiteering and underinvestment. Added to that, we are required to switch off our coal and oil-fired power stations within the next 3 years as a result of EU directives linked to CO2 levels. There is no meaningful building programme to provide energy on the horizon. So the question has to be asked, does David Cameron know something that we don't? Is it the case that Britain is not investing in future power generating capacity and other infrastructure because the decision has already been made that within the next 50 years it will not be needed? In Mexico, the WWF-inspired population control agenda is well on track. Mexico is seeking 13% more corn imports this year than has been the norm imposed by the North American Free Trade Agreement. The extra imports are needed to try and fill the shortfall resulting from the prolonged drought. As reported on this programme in February, Mexico is suffering from drought, not so much as a result of a shortage of water, but because a WWF imposed policy not to implement the Pleno Water Development Programme. It is estimated that this year's corn harvest in Mexico will be as low as 18 million tonnes, perhaps lower. The 2008 harvest was almost 25 million tonnes. According to Rabobank, the drought has damaged 19% of the corn grown across this year. The problem for Mexico is that corn shortages are expected to extend well beyond its borders this year. It is highly likely that it will not be able to source the 11 million tonnes of corn it needs. Here, the drought that never was, hyped by the WWF notion that we are at the end of the line for water resources on this planet. Keeping up the propagandist pressure, 2 Hollywood films have been released in the last few weeks, Watershed and Last Stop at the Oasis. Both films push the same WWF-inspired nonsense that humans are bad, we pollute, we must dehydrate and die. Last Step at the Oasis has been made by the same studio which brought a broadly gullible public the inconvenient truth. Watershed, which is being presented as a documentary, calls for a new water ethic for the entire planet, which means conserving scarce supplies by doing less. The fact that there is in the region of 326 million trillion gallons of water on this planet, which is roughly 53 billion gallons per person, seems to have passed them by. Antibiotics have become a staple drug prescribed by medical doctors around the world. They are taken for a number of illnesses and infections, from the very serious to the not so serious, such as the common cold. This dependence on a drug which wipes the body clean of both infection and immune system alike may be coming back to haunt us, as the genes responsible for birthing these superbacteria are becoming more and more prevalent. Margaret Chan, Director General of the World Health Organization, at a recent meeting in Copenhagen, Denmark, talking about the rise of superbacteria around the world, said, "Things as common as strep throat or a child's scratched knee could once again kill. Hip replacements, organ transplants, cancer chemotherapy and care of preterm infants would become far more difficult or even too dangerous to undertake." According to a recent report by Bloomberg, the spread of these antibiotic-resistant superbugs has become so extreme that even beneficial bacteria are being affected as well. Commenting on the latest bug to surface, NDM1, or New Delhi Metallobeta-lactamase 1, Donald E. Lowe, head of the Public Health Lab in Toronto, said, "If this latest bug becomes entrenched in our hospitals, there is really nothing we can turn to. Its potential is to be probably greater than any other organism." Though the widespread use of antibiotics to treat the most mild of illnesses is largely to blame, it is also the prevalent use of antibiotics fed to cattle, both dairy and meat producing, as well as other meat-producing animals, that has contributed to the increase of these superbugs. Birth defects are on the rise in Argentina, which can be attributed to an active ingredient, glyphosate, in Monsanto's Roundup, according to embryonic specialist Dr. Andre Carrasco. Carrasco's studies show that glyphosate exposure can cause defects in the brain, intestines, hearts of amphibian fetuses, of which he believes the results can be applied to humans. The amount of Roundup being used in the production of soy is some 1,500 times the amount used to show the defects in amphibians. Roundup Ready soy, a GMO from Monsanto, is now being used on a massive scale across the world, and this is no different in Argentina, who produce $16 billion worth of soy a year across 19 million hectares, 56% of Argentina's cultivated land, of which 98% is genetically modified. A staggering 190 million litres of glyphosate, the active agent in Roundup, is sprayed across Argentina annually, allegedly increasing the rates of illness dramatically and causing large amounts of deforestation. Monsanto's Roundup Ready soy beans are genetically modified to survive otherwise lethal doses of glyphosate, but unfortunately the human population is not. Soy has now become a staple part of Argentina's diet, so much so that the genetically modified soy was causing children to develop breasts to the extent that the authorities had to intervene with warnings. Sterility and miscarriages are also increasing. Most of us will already be aware that bees are mysteriously disappearing across the world, a phenomenon known as colony collapse disorder, or CCD. Since 2006, it is estimated that nearly 1/3 of all honeybee colonies have simply vanished, a devastating blow to the world which relies heavily on the activities of the bees in order to pollinate our crops. Viewers will be happy to hear then that one of the leading bee researchers, Biologics, who had made the study of colony collapse disorder their main priority, has been bought up by Monsanto. Biologics is considered by the United States Department of Agriculture to be one of the foremost bee research organisations in the world. Buying them out means that Monsanto can keep a close eye on what Biologics research discovers and what press releases the research company makes. The primary belief of many research organisations is that the introduction of open-air GM fields are to blame for the collapse. Other researchers believe that the sudden collapse of hives is due to the overuse of insecticides, which are sprayed upon virtually all genetically engineered Bt corn. Even the EPA, which gives the go-ahead for these toxins to be used, admits that pesticide poisoning is the probable cause of bee colony collapse. Economics news now. Calls for the return of Glass-Steagall are mounting globally as reality starts to dawn on politicians and economic commentators. That dawning reality is currently based around the Eurozone, which is looking likely to be the next phase of the collapse of the global financial system, unless there are any more JP Morgans out there waiting to announce multi-billion-dollar losses. The global financial markets are so fragile at the moment that any similar event has the potential to bring the whole system down. But while some are beginning to recognise that full separation of banks would be a first step in fixing our broken economies, the banking sector itself continues to squeal like a cornered rat whenever Glass-Steagall is mentioned. The reason they are so frightened is clear. They recognise that for the majority of humans on this planet, it is only the retail banking sector that is of any value to us. It is the retail banking sector which permits the economy to function. The retail banking sector is the only area of banking that it is necessary to protect. And in fact, the retail banking sector doesn't have much of a problem. All the banking problems lie in the speculative investment banking arms of the banks. So for as long as banks provide investment banking and retail services, bankers have an argument to make through their politician lackeys to justify the continuing bailouts and debt for future generations. But the cornered rat recognises very well that should it have its retail banking functions split off into separate businesses, there would be no need for government to keep bailing it out. It could and would be allowed to fail. The consequences for nations would be relatively minor. In the case of Britain, it would mean a few thousand job losses and the loss of some tax revenue. We would need to put measures in place to protect savings and pensions. Fixing the pension problems is no small task, admittedly. However, compared to the disaster we face if we continue to the insane policy of austerity and bailout, it's easy. Time is short. We must act now to reintroduce full Glass-Steagall style legislation now. If this does not happen, then the collapse of the euro, followed by other currencies, is inevitable. We are looking at the possibility that we have no money left to use which has any value. Meanwhile, in the Eurozone, with the hysteria over a Greek withdrawal from the euro now firmly in the mainstream, a run on the Greek banks is now underway. So far, that run on the banks has not seen queues outside branches, and there is no panic. Nonetheless, there has been a steady stream of withdrawals. Greek central bank head George Pavlopoulos told the Greek president that savers withdrew at least 700 million euros on Monday alone. But the trouble is not restricted to Greece. Spanish Prime Minister Rajoy dragged himself onto national television yesterday to warn the Spanish people that Spain is in danger of being locked out of capital markets completely. Today, Spain is attempting to raise between 1.5 and 2.5 billion euros in a bond auction. Spanish bonds were already trading well above the 6% threshold considered to be unsustainable. In his television broadcast, Rajoy made clear his fear that Spain will not raise what they need below what he described as an astronomical rate. Rajoy demanded the European Union step in once again to shore up the euro so that Greece does not leave. I think that would be a big mistake. Very bad news, and I believe public debt sustainability must be guaranteed and all of us must fulfil our commitments, he said. Charles de Lara, head of the Institute of International Finance, echoed Rajoy's sentiments, saying the Greek exit from the euro would be somewhere between catastrophic and Armageddon. The pressures on Spain, Portugal, even Italy, and conceivably Ireland could be immense, and the need for the Europe to step up with much greater support for the banking system would be sustainable. But step up de Lara means Europe should step up the speed of the printing presses. Former Prime Minister Tony Blair, considered by many to be a war criminal on the loose for his actions in viciously prosecuting the unlawful war in Iraq, has recently reaffirmed that he is a Christian. Measured against his success in creating the genocide of millions of Muslims in Iraq, not to mention the hundreds of deaths of British and American servicemen, Blair's Christian claim is clearly false. His track record in death, however, has not stopped Blair from appearing as a star guest at Nicky Gumbel's Alpha Course Jamboree, held in the Royal Albert Hall on Monday. Attended by more than 4,300 people from over 50 countries, the fawning delegates gave Blair a standing ovation. Many people consider the Alpha Course, which has swept through churches in Britain and worldwide, to be a form of common purpose for Christians. This view is reinforced by the fact that Nicky Gumbel gave a talk based on the Bible text, Love One Another, in which he said, "This is a conference with a purpose. The purpose is to see the transformation of our nation. The UK column suggests that holding up Bliar, a man who has been responsible for the wholesale slaughter of millions, as a Christian to be admired, reveals Gumbel's alpha cause as a perverted corruption of Christian faith. Significantly, Gumbel's reference to the transformation of our nation, without specifying what our nation will be transformed into, appears fully in line with the common purpose model for unspecified political and social change, and the drive for a false one-world religion. After heckling the Home Security Secretary Theresa May during her speech at the Police Federation annual conference in Bournemouth yesterday, the end of her talk was met with a wall of silence from the 1,200 police officers present. One officer described Mrs May as a disgrace after she had insisted it was not true that the government was singling out policing for budget cuts. "Let's stop pretending the police are being picked on," she said. "Every part of the public sector is having to take its share of the pain." She added that while the 20% budget cuts were challenging, they must be seen through for the good of our country. Mrs May's comments were of course untrue, since in reality the public sector cuts are to prop up the banking industry, which has been creating money out of nothing and loaning it to the government at interest. Mrs May also fail to tell her angry police audience that the Lib Con coalition is planning to spend more on overseas aid than the UK police force. The overseas aid budget is heading for £11.5 billion, whilst the Home Office budget for police is £8.8 billion. The hypocrisy of the Home Secretary was exposed early in the conference when Theresa May stated, "It is because the police are crime fighters that we will never privatise policing." Police in the audience were quick to point out that this was also untrue, since police services are already rapidly being privatised by the use of private security companies such as G4 Security, Serco and IBM. Officers jeered as a clearly harassed Theresa May told them regular fitness tests, new entry requirements to ensure the most talented recruits were hired, and direct entry for experienced individuals into senior ranks should all be welcome changes. Overall, the conference exposed the sheer arrogance of May and the Conservatives in their effort to destroy the police as a professional and publicly accountable service to protect individuals and communities. Alongside Secretary of State for Justice Ken Clarke's drive for secret courts, inquests and inquiries, it can be no coincidence that May is now also installing a web of unaccountable private security firms to work in partnership with national intelligence agencies such as GCHQ. The political precedence of secret courts and corporate power is fascism. Experienced police officers need to wake up before they have no job and live in a privatised police state. Staying on the subject of Theresa May, we would like to offer a heartfelt well done to Margaret Carroll, who managed to get the UK column all over the BBC lunchtime news yesterday. Margaret managed to get herself within a few feet of Mrs May and politely suggested to her that she would be arrested for treason if she set foot in the Police Federation conference venue. She then distributed 400 UK columns to the attending policemen and women and had a generally very positive response to her organising. Brilliant. And finally, Robert Greene is due to be released from prison today. We'd just like to wish him a safe trip home and look forward to speaking to him in due course. I am Malcolm Massey, and this has been the UK Column News. Thank you for watching.